small nation Sri Lanka was offered approximately $8 billion by China as a part of the One Belt, One Road initiative to build what it thought was going to be a flagship port which would bring prosperity to the south of the nation. That dream quickly turned into a nightmare of spiralling debt, with the result that in 2017, Sri Lanka was forced to hand over one of their major southern ports to the Chinese government. We're bringing you three arguments in this debate. One, that this is economically problematic for the countries on the road. Two, that this increases China's global influence in a negative way. And three, that this solidifies dictators or repressive governments' hold on power. What do we mean when we talk about the One Belt, One Road initiative? We mean the enormous Chinese foreign direct investment project to rebuild the ancient Silk Road trading routes. China plans to invest, by some estimates, up to $900 billion in countries along the old Silk Road. What's our stance in this debate? One, we believe the Belt and Road Initiative has been and will continue to be counterproductive and harmful to the world. Two, we support domestic infrastructure projects and we support the use of foreign aid and funding to fund those projects, but we do not believe China should be a major protagonist or indeed an influential actor in that process. Three, we support multilateral loans from organisations like the Asian Development Bank, the EU, the US, the IMF, the European Investment Bank. My first argument is about how it's economically damaging to countries on the road. Look, we can see that in the very short term, it might make economic sense for some of these countries to take Chinese loans. But in the long run, it's almost always problematic for smaller countries along the road, in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia, and in Africa. Whilst it's often perceived or portrayed by the Chinese government as free aid or loans designed to help these countries, it's actually a far more nefarious attempt to claim other things from them. We tell you that China exploits countries by giving loans it knows they won't be able to pay back. So whereas the Asian Development Bank, the US, the EU, the African Development Bank demand certain things economically from countries they invest in, like stable banking markets, like transparent financial industries, like limited corruption, like political stability, usually in the form of democracy, we tell you that's a good thing, because countries that lack the political or economic structures to become viable recipients of loans won't benefit from those loans in the first place. All those requirements help provide governments and incentivize governments to develop economies to the point when the loans that they get will be effectively used in those economies. By contrast, 1/3 of the countries that China have given loans to have been identified by the IMF of being in a high state of debt distress. Now, that's no coincidence. China actively seeks out and targets countries which won't pay back loans so that when they're unable to, it's able to demand a whole host of other things which prioritize Chinese interests over the long-term economic, social, and political development of those countries. What does that look like? One, it looks like the projects they're used for having to be built by Chinese contractors, like the railway between Djibouti and Ethiopia, funded and built entirely by Chinese contractors. So not only are these countries getting themselves into debt, which they have to pay interest on, half the money they get from China, they have to give straight back to China in the first place so that they build these loans. So China gives Djibouti $814 million and then demands that they give $400 million right back to China, and Djibouti are left with an $814 million bill plus interest, whereas China are left with a railway, a port, and owning all of that Djiboutian debt. Two, if they can't repay these loans, China takes control of major infrastructure projects with significant economic and national security value, like the port of Athens that was given up by Greece to China in repayment for China's loans, like mines in Angola which are today owned by China as a result of the fact that China has demanded them from those countries. Look, they're basically the international equivalent of loan sharks, guys, but that's not all. There are a number of economic disadvantages that accrue when countries are invested in by China. A, many of these projects are doomed to fail. Because they demand Chinese contractors who don't have local knowledge or experience with the communities or conditions in which they're working, these projects often never finish and the countries are left with a substantial amount of debt and nothing to show for it. In Pakistan, the Karachi Rail Project, the Gwadar Airport, the Diamond Basa Dam cost a total of $22 billion, but not one of them was finished, and yet Pakistan had to repay those loans regardless. The projects which do succeed, and of course some do, are the ones which further China's ability to control those countries. The projects which don't are the ones which would actually benefit the individuals in those countries. That's why Pakistan have literally rejected more aid and said they'll build the dam themselves because they've had enough of being exploited by China. Before I talk to you about why the One Belt, One Road initiative increases China's influence in the world in a problematic way, I'll take a point of information.
The greatest threat to freedom is when people on the ground don't have jobs, don't have electricity, don't have roads, and don't have money. How does your side solve this problem?
Ed's going to talk to you in his speech about the way that China, as compared to the international community, gives loans, actually entrenches the interests of illiberal powers. But basically, because China has no incentive to encourage democratization, to encourage pushes towards liberalization in a way that other international organizations do, China doesn't require those things from dictators. Instead, it just gives them big white elephant projects that they can distract their populaces with while they continue to oppress them. Let's talk about how the One Belt, One Road initiative increases China's influence in a problematic way. First thing to note here is that China is a bad actor. A, China is effectively a dictatorship, and President Xi has ensured that he will be in power for at least the foreseeable future. B, China consistently suppresses political and social dissidents internally. And 3, China persistently abstains or vetoes resolutions in the United Nations that would harm repressive regimes like Syria, like Zimbabwe, like Myanmar. We are principally against an actor as repugnant as this gaining more power globally. And we think that it's only as a consequence of China's global influence that people so often overlook how illiberal and how repressive it is. So the thing to note here is that the One Belt, One Road policy is the most ambitious policy to increase China's global influence. We've shown you why that's not something you should support. A, because as a condition for the economic loans that it provides under this system, it demands political support from the countries that it provides those loans to. For every 10% more times that African nations vote alongside China in the United Nations, they receive, on average, an 83% increase in the amount of aid they get. So, surprise, surprise, in 2005, when the United Nations voted on expanding the Security Council, which we think would have been a great thing, it was African nations who prevented that from happening because China didn't want Japan getting a veto. The second mechanism here is that China uses the Belt and Road Initiative to gain support for aggressive foreign policy objectives, which it has. Papua New Guinea was economically forced into, for the first time, officially recognizing China's legitimacy in the South China Sea in 2016 as a result of the incredible stranglehold that China had over the economy of Papua New Guinea. They have their finger on the jugular of these countries, and they can use that to pressure them into giving international support for their policies and to controlling their economies. Overall, all of the steps that China has taken to increase the influence, its own influence, using the One Belt, One Road policy, have made the world a worse place. We think the world would be better off if these countries used multilateral, international, or domestic funding for infrastructure projects. So, because we've shown you how, one, when countries accept Chinese loans under the One Belt, One Road initiative, that is actually worse off for those countries in the long run, and two, how China is using this as a soft power initiative to gain more international prestige, I beg you to propose.
So proposition talks a good game about sovereignty and democracy. But the greatest threat to all of this is when people are trapped by the shackles of poverty. Recognize the BRI is the reason why locals in Pakistan, Kazakhstan, and Thailand have jobs, money, electricity, and schools for the first time. That alone is a good thing. What is our stance in opposition? First, we support the BRI. This means we support a system where China provides developing countries with low-interest loans that allow them to build a basic infrastructure like power grids, highways, and airports. A, simply not enough, B, charge far higher interests, or C, come attached with strict conditionalities that privilege only Western interests. We're going to forward three arguments. First, that the BRI creates economic development. Second, that it prevents Chinese aggression. And third, in our second speaker, that our side strengthens trade networks. Before that, some housekeeping. Let's deal with their policy. Because they will have foreign aid and multilateral donors like the IMF. This is simply unviable today for three reasons. First, the West is becoming increasingly unreliable and insular. The emblem of Trump's America is literally America first. And under Trump, the US has cut contributions to the IMF by 1/3. Furthermore, just look at the EU's financial woes in a recessionary climate, which is precisely why it has cut budgets for international aid by 10 billion euros. But second, even where Western aid is offered, it comes with highly restricted conditionalities, so very few countries actually meet this criteria to receive aid. And this is odd, because from our position we hear that strict conditionalities are actually a good thing, because countries that don't deserve to get it, don't get it. I'm not sure who proposition is to dictate who exactly is deserving of aid, who exactly should be deserving of living in poverty, and who should not be able to do so. I think they need to prove to us why they can say that certain countries just don't deserve this aid. Furthermore, it's just not true that the IMF is always good. Look at Latin America and crippling debt crisis that cripples it to this day. We think all of this shows that these are not actually viable alternatives. So, the reality proposition to stand for is one where without the BRI, millions of rural villagers across Asia and Africa will be mired in abject poverty because they have no one else to turn to. So, first point rebuttal. What exactly is China like? We think this example battlefield is really symmetric because for every example of a Hamato port, we can give you other examples of good projects. So the question to ask is incentives. And we argue, we completely agree that China is self-interested. That's why its interests converge with the people it's trying to help. For a few reasons. First, its desire for legitimacy. Because many countries are very suspicious of this new BRI initiative. It's in China's interest not to confirm these suspicions by proving themselves to be sending these countries in debt. Second, China obviously prefers a world where trade partners are doing well, as opposed to a system of debt slavery, because it wants mutually beneficial trade deals with other flourishing economies. If China really wants to achieve its status of being an economic hegemon, it wants to be a big brother of a flourishing region, not a failing one, as your side claims would be. So really clearly China's incentive to be good to these nations. Second question, about the specific how they talk about. So the first one they talk about is about this whole idea of a debt trap. First, I tell you why you won't get money from any other countries. Second, that is not a debt, it's not an A point or a bad thing for governments. It's only bad when the interest rate is higher than that of the GDP growth rate of these countries. And we argue for three reasons BRI is not a problem. Because first, it offers low interest loans. Second, because most of these countries that China is dealing with are experiencing rapid economic growth, that means they are able to pay these loans. And third, GDP growth is hugely helped by infrastructure projects that China builds. So this actually helps them to develop. Now I want to take down this shining bright example of Djibouti and Hamato ports. First, it's not actually all that bad that China is operating a port for free for you, so it's really more like an offshoring agreement. But second, in any case, the fiasco in Hamato has led other countries like Malaysia, Cambodia, and Thailand to renegotiate contracts on better terms with China. So there is already a self-correcting mechanism for all of their problems. The last point they bring to us is that China is repugnant, and therefore no one will want to crack down on them anymore. We think the question is, if China is so terrible, the question is when do we plug them into the global economy, and when do we have global scrutiny on their actions? That happens in our world when people like your side can criticize them for harmful actions they're actually engaging in. So we begin the crucial trade-off here. We think in the short term we will have less sovereignty in relation to China, but at the long term we have more sovereignty because we have more economic development on our side. First argument. While the BRI creates economic development. Before I go on, yes.
Loans from China are on average 1,100% more expensive than loans from Japan. Which country do you think they should be taking loans
I mean,
from?
if you want to compare the worst extreme examples, Japan is literally in recession right now, so I'm not sure what is a better example for your side. Back to my case. We think the BRI creates economic development because it provides countries with money and expertise to build vital infrastructure. Collectively, China has funded more than 1 trillion yuan worth of projects, and subcontractors have branched out to participating countries to develop infrastructure. This provides two unique benefits. First, the process of construction is hugely beneficial because many Chinese construction firms employ locals, and therefore this helps locals by giving them jobs and expertise in fields like mining and excavation. Second, the final product benefits people on the ground because the transportation networks built into the BRI provides locals with jobs and money by plugging them into the global economy and improving local connectivity. So in Central Asia, the Eurasian land bridge connects markets in China and Europe. The BRI also involves the construction of vital infrastructure like energy grids and schools, and in Pakistan, power plants worth over $33 billion have been built to alleviate chronic energy shortages, so our side helps all of these people. And these economic benefits will simply be stifled away by corruption, because Xi Jinping's entire domestic platform is based on a vehement anti-corruption narrative. Condoning corruption will only serve to undermine his legitimacy. So our side achieves economic development. Second argument about how our side prevents Chinese aggression. So let's take proposition at their highest and assume that China does actually have perverse incentives. These incentives will exist on both sides. The question is, how will China expand its influence? Without the BRI, China will resort to far more coercive methods. What would this look like? It may look like threats, threatening to impose sanctions, to cut off trade routes, to reopen border disputes. And in some cases, this means also involve military maneuvering, so building forces on reclaimed islands in the South China Sea or deploying Chinese platoons overseas. So if their concern is really about sovereignty, these outcomes become far worse on their side. So I suggest we win not just on economic development, but also sovereignty. So what is the comparative on our way? I think the BRI is better because there is a far more benign means of economic expansion. If anything, it creates a win-win situation where neighboring countries benefit from development as well. More importantly, China has no incentive to turn to more coercive means of expanding its influence, because methods like threats and military maneuvering are high-risk strategies because they sour relations, they invite conflict, they run the risk of superpower retaliation. China only has an incentive to turn to this high-risk strategy when low-risk strategies like the BRI are not available. So with the BRI, there is no incentive on our side comparatively to take on this risk. And to be clear, proposition can't simply ignore the nuance of this argument by claiming that China will use both the BRI and other means of coercion, because the BRI is what precludes these more coercive forms of Chinese aggression. So I suggest, if you really want to talk about sovereignty, our side actually protects this. But more importantly, with the crucial benefits of economic development, you're first going to consider that it is not important that some countries should not get this development. We think that is despicable. For all of these reasons, the Belt and Road Initiative builds a road towards progress. We stand very firmly in opposition.
From the very first minute of the first proposition speech in this debate, we have thus far provided you with a very clear alternative mechanism to that of Chinese investment. And some opposition stand up and say, oh, well, that's just not good enough because their interest rates are too high. And we come back in the PY and say that is factually inaccurate. States like Japan, in spite of a recession, are still able to offer interest rates that are far less predatory than those of China. But they continue to complain about conditions. So this leads us to ask, what are the conditions that the IMF, that Europe, that America currently impose on the loans that China doesn't? Is it the interest rates that we've told you are factually untrue? Or is it the human rights conditions? Is it the environmental legislation? Is it the democratization targets that tell Chinese businesses, on the other hand, that investing in Uganda, that propping up dictatorship is unacceptable, and that endorsing countries that criminalize homosexuality is unacceptable? We think it's the latter. That is my substantive contribution to the debate. Before I tell you about how these projects solidify the hold and power of dictators and illiberal leaders, I'm going to do two things. First, respond to the little responses that they gave to Arthur's 8 minutes of constructed material, and second, look back at the two substantive arguments introduced by their first speaker.
On the first of those things, Arthur tells you about how these projects are economically poor ideas for these nations. So for them to stand up and say, oh, the best way for you to find liberalisation in these nations is through economic means, it's just not good enough. Because we tell you structurally why these investments do not actually help people on the ground. What were those reasons? One, that factually, on a factual basis, the interest rates are higher and the practices are more predatory. They stand up and say that these are low interest rates. We say, one, that's just not true. But even if it were true, the reason they afford such low interest rates is they know that people are unable to repay the debt in the first place. And that is the point at which China seizes your sovereign territory. That is the point at which China puts a gun to your head and tells you to vote for them in the next UN election. But they didn't respond to arguments 2 through 4 that Arthur provided you in his first argument. Stuff about how only the strategic projects that China is interested in are the ones that go to completion. So Pakistan does have schools being built, it has pipelines, it has roads, it has superhighways, crucially that only enable China, but that don't actually help local businesses, local producers. The third thing he tells you here is that actually in lots of these instances there is a one-size-fits-all approach. That means that this just isn't tailored towards the creation of individual schools in an area, it's more about headline infrastructural projects. No response there. The last thing they stand up to say, the second argument we bring you is that of political influence. That China uses this to gain more power on the world stage, and that is on a principled level in this debate a bad thing. Their only response to this argument is to say, oh no, but if China gets more power on the world stage and more people can see the bad things that it's doing, then it's more likely to attract criticism. This is a bizarre argument. By the logic of this, they would be happy with China invading sovereign nations on the grounds that that would attract more criticism. We tell you that is exactly what they are doing. They're doing it under the mask of one belt, one road. Finally, they say your mechanism in this debate isn't functional because we have an isolationist America, we have a series of organisations like the IMF that are unwilling to give money. One, the example I give is that Trump's America cutting their overseas aid budget by $10 billion pales in comparison with the several hundreds of billions that it continues to give every year through all of the other back channels that the US is still operating through Congress. Second of all, that is one of 5 actors we outlined in our start to this debate. We're talking about the European Union, that even in the midst of several countries trying to leave, in 2018 will preside in excess of $150 billion. Don't talk to us about $5 billion cut here or there. So, what are the arguments they brought you in constructive? The first thing they say is that this helps the local economies to be plugged into the global economy. One, this is just such an unbelievably cut and paste argument to bring into this debate, specifically when they don't engage with Arthur's sophisticated analysis about one, these businesses don't employ local people, all of the money is exported, and two, the very predatory nature of these things means that China now owns your school, China now owns your port, China now owns your infrastructure, and taxes local people to use it. The second argument that they bring into this debate is that of this containing Chinese aggression. 2 responses here. The first is that this is just not true. In lots of instances, this is used as a pretext for expanding Chinese aggression. We point you to the example of Sri Lanka, where they literally stationed battleships outside of the port in order to seize it. We point you to an example like the South China Sea and small island nations there. They have increased investment in these areas, but when they default on their debts, they use as a pretext to invade. That is crucially the comparison in this debate. So, before I move on to my argument about how these projects solidify the hold on power of dictators and liberal progressive leaders, I'll take one information if you have one. So, this happens in 2 ways. First, they entrench leaders through corruption. Note that, 1, the sprawling nature of this project, stemming literally the circumference of the globe, no thank you, and 2, the corruption that is endemic to the autocratic Chinese government, something they never responded to, means that many of these projects see conscious or more discreet embezzlement. This looks like leaders being allowed to siphon funds in these small nations, for example, the president of Kazakhstan, or they're just handed a fat money clip of cash by the Chinese government. Their only response, implicit in their first case, is to say, oh, well, the drive towards corruption in China is what, towards anti-corruption in China is one that is ongoing. But we tell you that the country has absolutely no democratic standards, that, as I'm going to tell you in a minute, has actively funded a number of dictatorships. This just doesn't stand. In countries that are struggling economically, cash is used by these leaders to prop themselves up. This looks like buying election results, bribing rivals, funding secret police forces. The best example we can point you to here is that of Kyrgyzstan, where in October 2017, the current president was handed $10 million of difficulty fees, quote unquote, by the Chinese government. 2 months later, he won an election described by the Democracy Project as, and I quote, containing almost unprecedented levels of vote buying. You do the maths on that one. The second way in this which this entrenches dictatorship is that it entrenches leaders through personal association. There are 2 bits of context you have to understand in the project here. One, that the Chinese approach is one that exploits its own state-controlled media to outwardly construct close personal relationships with leaders of the nations in which it's investing. And it does this, no thank you, because it wants to prevent these nations from pulling out in the future. The second bit of context, and this is one we've already very thoroughly landed in this debate, is that these initiatives are trophy cabinet in nature. We're talking not about the construction of schools or hospitals, but big, sexy, headline-grabbing infrastructure projects that are very superficial. Bridges to nowhere, superhighways that literally just end in deserts, dams producing electricity in areas that have small populations. Before I tell you about what exactly that means for leaders, I'll take a POI.
To be clear, we made it very clear that China's interest is to boost their global trade. So why do you think they'll build bridges that lead to nowhere as opposed to plugging it into the global economy?
What we told you is that they do want to boost their global trade, but that is by providing infrastructure that is advantageous to them, often directly at the expense of local populations. So they, for example, build roads or build bridges or build railways through Central Asia, but do not allow local people to access them. What is the consequence of leaders being able to entrench their power through personal association? We think it means that leaders use these big headline-grabbing projects to distract from other issues like the constriction of personal freedoms. We point to the example of Uzbekistan, where in September 2005, a $1.5 billion port was funded by the Chinese government. And just 2 months later, the former interim prime minister was appointed, by himself, president for life. These things allow leaders to take control of countries. But at this point, you're probably asking, what is the comparison we bring you on side proposition? It's one we introduced in the first minute of our first speech, and that is conditional loans. We tell you international institutions are far more frequently than China attach liberalisation or democratisation targets, but specifically these are difficult for leaders to stomach at the moment. The best example we can give you of this aid being preferable in terms of human rights is Myanmar, when in the same week as the US government classified the acts against Rohingya people as genocide, the Chinese government built a bridge in Rakhine, the epicenter of abuse of those populations. If you think this policy is economically advantageous to those countries, maybe you're voting opposition. But it isn't, and that's why this debate should go wrong.
I would like the second speaker the proposition for their speech, and I invite the second speaker the opposition to deliver their speech.
We think there is nothing wrong when countries choose to align themselves with China to stave off economic ruin. Unless you want to tell us that every single developing country involved in the BRI is run by a government that only wants to oppress its people, I think they have to admit that there is a reason why these countries are turning to the BRI. The reason is because they realize that the arrogance of the IMF and the lack of money coming from the West means that this is the best way for them to help their people. That is what we stand for. I want to talk about two things. First, politics. Second, economics. So let's start with politics. Now I want to point out that a lot of their arguments are not unique to China. Talk about China forcing you to vote in line with its interests in the UN. The US does it too. Like Trump literally said, I'll take note of who voted against my resolution in the UN. I would suggest Trump is even worse than China in this respect. Similarly, talk about the liberal government. Guys, the US literally gives weapons to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia uses these weapons to kill insurgents and civilians in Yemen. Saudi Arabia literally legalized the right to drive after China. So I suggest the liberal governments being funded are equally a thing that happens with the US. In fact, I suggest that proposition has got it wrong, because development is what leads to more liberalization and less corruption in the long term. You can't take away the liberal governments and then create development. You need development first. That is because development is what allows, for example, middle-class populations to get education and the social-cultural capital they need to fight back against oppression. So it's precisely the arrogance of the IMF that stands in that case. The idea that first you must be liberal, then you give you money. That's the wrong way to go about liberalizing a country. They said you have to send for invading sovereign countries. No, because invasion takes away the sovereignty of other countries. Development increases the sovereignty of these countries. And if China invades these countries, no country will turn to the BRI. So the idea of how it's a pretext when they take away debt, when they station warships outside your port. If China does that, no country will join the BRI, and China won't be able to achieve any of his self-interested benefits. So I think that's just a weak rebuttal to our argument. More importantly, we told you the comparative is far more positive. And look, their only rebuttal to our second argument is this whole pretext of stationing warships outside your port, which I've already taken down. They never rebut the core logic that all of these things, like threatening through military maneuvering, are high-risk strategies because they can in fact retaliate from other powers and because they weaken China's reputation. China only does that when low-risk strategies like the BRI aren't available. So even on their best count of China having malicious incentives, it will be more coercive on their sides. All their house about Djibouti and taking away sovereignty will be even worse when China actually sends troops in. So, more importantly, we think it's not true they are actually trading off huge amounts of sovereignty. Now, the second speaker likes to use that. It's just factually true that debt levels are smaller. Well, you know what? I think if the debt levels, for example, the interest levels were really smaller, then countries would just choose the IMF. They say the reason why they don't do it is because of corruption, and that's the only reason why it's not good. But first of all, we told you, China doesn't stand for corrupt regimes because Xi Jinping's literally, his entire push is about anti-corruption. Furthermore, development is what alleviates corruption because public sector workers only take bribes because they aren't paid enough. We alleviate corruption when we have development first on our side. More importantly, we told you that there are incentives for why China has no reason to mire countries in huge debt. And no, they can never actually deal with our structural incentives. How economically a debt crisis hurts China's trade prospects. How politically many participating countries have a bad history of colonialism with the West, so they're obviously a lot more suspicious. And if anything, all of that debacles of Angolan mines and Hamadoda port are precisely, as my first speaker said, the reason why countries are now renegotiating their loans. So it's a self-correcting mechanism against something the second speaker dropped. Another thing the second speaker dropped, we told you how it's not that bad when China runs your port for free, because the goods and services still flow through your country. So it's almost like they're actually benefiting you in a win-win situation. But let me deal with their best case, that countries are surrendering a huge part of their sovereignty to China. Our argument is that trading off some of the sovereignty in the short term to achieve economic development actually gives you more sovereignty in the long term. This is because there is no point being nominally sovereign if you aren't developed. Sure, you have the freedom to use money, but this is money you don't actually have. You have the freedom to state your position at the UN, but everyone ignores you because the language of real politics is money and development, and no one talks to you when they are a small, undeveloped country. So, the comparative is you would rather have a country that is rich and dependent on China than poor and independent of China, because you have less sovereignty in relation to China, but more sovereignty in relation to every other country, and more sovereignty in relation to your internal affairs, because sovereignty is equally about a government's ability to do what it wants within its country. Now that nicely leads me on to my second contention, therefore, on economic impacts. Before I go on, sure.
The reason countries take higher interest Chinese loans over lower interest international ones is that, as we told you, the international community demands functioning economies in which these loans can be effective.
Well,
why do you not give countries an easy way out in China?
Well, as I just told you, the reason why they accept it is because all of these conditions are backwards. They aren't actually a good model of development. I've literally told you why that's not true. But fine, let me give you a lot more reasons, alright? So the first is that Western countries just don't have spare cash lying around. There is slowing economic growth in the US, there is an aging population in the EU. China is literally one of the only countries with massive amounts of spare cash lying around. So the comparative is not EU and IMF loans versus China loans. The comparative is China loans versus no loans at all. Furthermore, we told you the EU is becoming increasingly insular. They said there are 6 actors. Yes, the point is there's a broad trend across the West of increasing popularism and the idea of increasing insularity. Maybe they can throw fancy numbers at us, but they need to give us structural incentives on how. Just look at Trump, who says America first. Even if there's only cut a small portion now, in the next few years, he's going to cut a huge amount of portion from the US contributions. Finally, Western countries are less politically stable, they are less reliable. Look at Merkel, for example, who is struggling to put together a coalition. The fact they are struggling to put together stable governments is the whole reason why they don't have the political stability needed to give out loans to random countries. So the point is this, it is not a comparative that countries are taking Chinese loans because that is the only way to sustain corrupt governments. Countries are taking Chinese loans because that is the only way to get loans they need. We don't think it's true that these are not finished because the idea is how we can have expertise through public-private partnerships. We don't think it's true that these are trophy cabinet projects because if they were just trophy cabinet projects, people on the ground would be pretty unhappy with your government when your government is spending billions of dollars building a trophy cabinet that doesn't actually connect to their homes, and they will tend to overthrow the oppressive government if they were really so economically disenfranchised. My argument for today, therefore, is on how we strengthen global trading networks. A central claim here is that the BRI reinforces the global system of free trade. Why is this claim true? A key observation to make is that the BRI centers around creating trade routes in line with the original Silk Road. So they already admit there's overland corridors spreading outward from China, maritime trade routes across China all the way to the Mediterranean. What China is doing is essentially massively subsidizing free trade between China and these countries, and also between these countries themselves, by building infrastructure that is essential to the transport